For millions of years, Africa lay undisturbed, a continent shrouded in mystery, a world where nature ruled supreme. Africa was once home to the greatest variety of creatures the world had ever known. Now, 150 years after the arrival of colonial settlers, less than 1% of the wild animals remain. And for the wilderness, it is the 11th hour. With endurance and speed, herds once migrated across these savanna grasslands. This was Eden, a time of great abundance, an era of plenty. It is now the end of that era. Herds of animals moved seasonally across the African plains. These ecosystems appear rich and fertile, but in truth, they are extremely vulnerable. They are Africa's low rainfall regions. The climate is erratic and unpredictable here. In some years, there's abundant rainfall. In others, extended drought. All life is adapted to coping with these fluctuating weather cycles. Grass is the foundation of the savanna's complex food chain. Where there's grass, there is life. Just as the animals depend on grass, so the grass in turn depends on rain. Rainfall is erratic and usually only occurs during 3 or 4 months of the year. When it does rain, it comes in torrential downpours. Rains are localized, and while one area may receive a heavy downpour, another nearby can be left entirely dry. Over the millennia, a great diversity of animal life evolved here. These species are complementary feeders. This means that different types of animals feed on different parts of the same plant. For example, the zebra prefer to eat the coarser upper parts of the grasses, exposing the more nutritious midsections, which are in turn eaten by the wildebeest. The lower levels are then eaten by other species. All life that evolved here is adapted to survive the frequent dry spells. Drought is a regular part of these weather cycles. For millions of years, man was as much a part of nature as the animals he hunted. Man is physically not well suited to his predatory role. But the human mind, with its creative ingenuity, gives him a decisive edge over other species. Though not always successful at first, man seldom went hungry for long. More so than any other species, he was quick to devise alternate ways to satisfy his everyday needs. Human numbers were regulated by disease and high infant mortality. The hostile environment kept man in balance with the natural world. For millions of years, low human numbers and simple technology made it impossible for man to deplete his resources or destroy the environment.
Man's survival depended on his intimate understanding of the natural world he lived in. Life was often cruel for primitive man, but no more so for him than any other animal. He was part of a world where only the fittest survived, and he was a successful species living in a productive environment. Man has always lived off the land, and he is no less dependent on it now than he was back in the mists of prehistory.
But now, the era of limitless resources has ended. Over the last 50 years, human numbers in Africa have become an increasing threat to both the environment and man himself. The current increase in Africa's population is leading to starvation. Many communities overwhelm their available food supply. In recent years, the media has graphically depicted the growing plight of Africa's famine victims. Drought has been blamed for their predicament. Contrary to this popular belief, drought is not the culprit. Droughts are a regular phenomenon here. Famine is man-made.
When you see a picture of a starving African child on your television, you identify with them. You want to help them. You send food. But food isn't the answer. There isn't enough food or money in all of the industrialized societies to feed all of Africa forever. We can't have famines on the size and magnitude of the famine in Ethiopia and come to their rescue every year. Africa has always had famines. Drought is not a new thing in Africa.
Over the past 50 years, Africa's human population has doubled from 250 million to a staggering 500 million. As these populations grow, their predicament worsens, and in times of drought, millions of them are threatened by famine. For many communities, food aid is their only hope of survival. As these numbers grow, their lives become more dependent on the food trucks. Salvation comes from faraway places like America, Europe, Australia, and a host of other nations. All of them now ship food to distribution centers here in Africa. Hunger has steadily worsened over the years. These supplies have become Africa's lifeblood. Foreign development agencies invest increasing amounts of money in Africa's agricultural and industrial development every year. As shown here on the graph, this development has steadily grown, but for some mysterious reason, so has hunger. 15 years ago, foreign food aid in Africa did not exist. Africa was able to feed itself. Between 1970 and 1984, food aid grew to a staggering 2.5 million metric tons. The next year would see famine run rife and food aid rocketed to a frightening 6.5 million metric tons. In just 15 years, food aid to sub-Saharan Africa had increased almost 2,000%. Meanwhile, Africa's food production had steadily declined. In dry years, it plummeted. What these figures mean is that over the last 15 years, Africa has become less capable of feeding itself. Clearly, something is wrong. One problem is now evident: cattle. These domesticated animals are man's traditional method of food production. Both Africans and Europeans alike
believe that if reared in sufficient numbers, cattle can become the answer to our protein needs. Cattle are totally unsuited to this type of arid, low-rainfall region. They evolved in Europe and Asia in areas of high rainfall where grass and water are plentiful. These animals live off a single food source, grass. In Africa's low rainfall regions, where soil is poor and the climate has long dry spells and regular droughts, they easily devastate the rangeland as they struggle to survive. In the dry season, the herds cluster near drinking pools, overgrazing the surrounding areas. These pathetically ill-equipped creatures are left to starve in a wasteland created by their own appetites. In these areas, high numbers of domestic animals are the primary cause of a deadly phenomenon, desertification. Desertification has become an environmental disease, now spreading like a malignant cancer across Africa's low rainfall regions. This is where the low rainfall regions occur. They stretch in an immense and almost continuous arc from the Sahara in the north to East Africa and then on to the Great Plains of Southern Africa and the Cape. The countries worst affected by famine are all located in the low rainfall regions. The red shows where desertification has taken hold and is spreading. Satellite pictures indicate that desertification now expands at a rate of 35,000 square miles a year. What you see was once productive grassland. In recent years, foreign aid programs financed new wells in the area. They also established veterinary facilities, so the cattle herds grew. And they did so at the cost of the one resource man can never replace, productive land. This is how it was. This is what man has made of it. Currently, 100 square miles of productive land is being invaded by desertification every day. The mechanism of desertification is simple. Once an area has been overgrazed, the sun's energy is reflected off the barren earth. Then the ground heats up the surrounding air. As it does, it dries out the moisture. Rain is dependent on moisture-laden air. As there is less moisture in the air, rainfall decreases. Desertification becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, continually growing and affecting new areas. The desert spreads, downgrading all vulnerable ecosystems. To these nomads, the accumulation of cattle is traditionally considered a measure of wealth. Cattle are rarely sold or consumed. They simply represent the financial state of a community. Domestic animals are a kind of tribal bank. The size of a herd reflects the affluence of the community. They lavish attention on their prized possessions and believe that large herds are a protection against drought, and that the bigger the herd, the more animals will survive a bad year. It is estimated that at the current rate of destruction, more than 80% of Africa's rangelands now used for domestic stock will eventually become desert. Every year, goats become more common throughout Africa. The reason is simple. They, unlike cattle, feed off a wide variety of plants. They survive easily in these downgraded ecosystems. For nomads, goats are the last buffer between a traditional way of life and abject poverty.
The old African belief that surplus domestic animals represent security is now assisted by veterinary technology. The result, an increase in animals competing for food in steadily downgraded and abused environments. The inevitable outcome, destitution. All over Africa, people like these now suffer the same fate, a plight caused by an inability to recognize the environment as a perishable and finite resource, easily destroyed and impossible to replace. This generation has now little to look forward to. Their environment is collapsing, taking with it their traditional way of life. The next generation will eventually be forced to leave this ravaged land and seek refuge in the cities, condemned to a life of urban squalor.
Goats are remarkably resilient creatures, but even for them, there is a time when nothing is left. Once all the available vegetation within reach is destroyed, the nomads are forced to cut down the remaining trees in an attempt to keep their precious animals alive. This community is about to become the victim of desertification.
For many others, help comes in cans, but food aid can only help them to survive here for a little longer. The environment is shattered. Their fate is sealed. Africa's growing demand for food aid is directly related to the abuse of ecosystems. For millions of people, productive land is an essential commodity, and they totally depend on it. By destroying their environment, they court disaster. This community will soon be forced to flee from here or be swallowed up by the desert.
Not all of Africa's low rainfall areas are open savanna. Much of the land is mountainous and wooded. These are the watersheds or catchment areas, birthplace of rivers. The vegetation on these slopes is essential to the stability of soil and the health of river systems. Once only a few families of subsistence farmers lived here. Now, as human numbers grow, more people settle in these catchments. Trees are cut down and crops planted. Nature's balance is upset. As more people abandon their traditional subsistence lifestyle and become part of a cash-oriented economy, more land is needed to produce more. As human numbers grow, they show no concern for these delicate watershed ecosystems. Forests are a vital component here. They are essential to healthy watersheds. The loss of forests affects rivers.
As growing communities develop these areas, cattle move to and from water. They trample and compact the earth, and soon cattle paths crisscross the steep slopes. When the seasonal downpours occur, water runs down the hillsides, channeled by the cattle paths. The rains wash away the exposed earth. This is the beginning of erosion. As erosion takes hold, the water cuts deeper and wider every time it rains, washing away the topsoil. Topsoil that took thousands of years to create and will take just as long to replace. The abuse of watersheds is only the first step leading to inevitable disaster. The more topsoil that is lost, the less fertile the land becomes and less vegetation grows. As water drains faster off the eroded slopes, the erosion spreads, feeding on itself in an increasingly destructive cycle. As rainwater pours off eroded watersheds, streams become raging torrents. The topsoil that colors the water is a sure sign of a dying catchment and a dying river. Eroded catchments are causing more rivers to overflow, and as they flash flood, they affect places hundreds of miles away. These rivers overflow regularly now, creating erosion and devastation in the surrounding areas. Once the rains end, the rivers quickly dry out, revealing millions of tons of displaced soil. Many rivers that a few years ago were navigable, flowing throughout the year, are now shallow, silted streams. As rivers are clogged, silt builds up in dams, reducing their water-holding capacity. Agriculture is always affected, especially intensive farming. The cash crops grown in Africa don't originate in these dry areas. They come from more temperate, high rainfall places, and they need water, lots of it. They cannot survive the dry months without irrigation. For some African countries, farming these cash crops is helping pay back development loans to the industrialized world. Crops like corn, wheat, tobacco, beans, tea, coffee, and sugarcane. All these crops have one thing in common. During the dry months, they depend on irrigation. If it stops, they die. These high-yield crops are quick to drain nutrients from the soils. Fertilizers are seldom used here because of the expense. It is cheaper for the developers to move to new land. Once a project becomes unprofitable, they simply abandon it, move on, and leave behind a wasteland. Other ventures are then initiated in unexploited parts. And so it goes, on and on. In a few places, the wilderness still flourishes. These are healthy ecosystems with the natural animals and plants still living there. These areas have survived till now because they were effectively protected from man by nature. The custodian of these areas is this small insect, the tsetse fly, carrier of trips or trypanosomiasis, a disease fatal to domestic animals. Though the bite of this small creature is deadly to cattle, wild animals are immune to it. The tsetse fly is seldom fatal to humans, but its presence effectively keeps man out because he cannot enter these areas with domestic stock. Without the tsetse fly here to protect it, much more of Africa's wilderness would have by now been destroyed. The tsetse fly is nature's last line of defense against man, and it has done a better job of protecting the wilderness than all the conservationists that ever lived. The Okavango Delta in Botswana is the tsetse's domain. But now man wants the wilderness, and he has come to fight nature for it. Sponsored by foreign development agencies and supported by local governments, the war begins. Nature is powerless before it. Foreign development agencies spend millions of dollars annually trying to eradicate the tsetse fly. They quite simply want today's tsetse fly areas as replacement land for devastated cattle country. Once the project begins, squadrons of spray planes are stationed at makeshift bases within easy striking distance of the enemy. These planes will deposit tons of lethal poison over the wilderness. Development agencies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars in the war against the tsetse fly. The money spent has primarily benefited the international chemical companies rather than the local people. Pesticides used against the tsetse are notorious for their effects on fish and insect life, and ultimately, the entire food chain. In Europe and America, men handling these chemicals would be wearing protective clothing and masks. But in those places, most of these chemicals are now banned because of their destructive effect on the environment. The planes are often dangerously overloaded, and so they have dump valves. In the event of any mechanical problem, they simply dump their cargo over the wilderness before landing. Aerial spraying takes place at night when the air is still and the tsetse fly is most vulnerable. Tonight we'll see the end of an irreplaceable part of Africa. For the wilderness, it is the 11th hour. The next day, nothing appears to have been disturbed. But from now on, nothing can be the same again. Instinct development will lead many of these animals away from the human invasion. They will flee now as they always have in the past. But unlike the past, there is nowhere left to go. While aerial spraying takes place at night, ground spraying teams eliminate any remaining pockets of resistant flies by day. Deadly chemicals like dieldrin, endosulfan, and DDT are commonly used in Africa, and so people and the environment are continually contaminated. It may be difficult to accept that the advocates of these devastating programs are aware of the destructive forces they unleash, but it is a crime that has gone unaccounted for time and time again over the past 20 years. Once these natural areas are invaded by man, the wild animals soon disappear, and then the ecosystems change. These regions evolved over millions of years. The animals and plants living here evolved together, the nature of the one dependent on the nature of the other. Wild animals play an important part in maintaining these sustainable and productive ecosystems. The secret to nature's success is not even remotely understood, though it is generally agreed by scientists that species diversity plays a large part in maintaining a productive ecosystem. The species living in an area are determined by the availability and types of vegetation.
Where there are bushes and trees, there are leaf-eating creatures. These are browsers. Most of their moisture requirements are met by the succulent plants and leaves they eat. For most species here, water is the rarest commodity. All animals evolved here developing special ways to cope with drought. The most efficiently adapted animal here is this medium-sized gazelle, the gerenuk. The gerenuk lives entirely on its diet of leaves and does not drink water. Though the gerenuk has been the subject of much scientific study, no one has ever seen it drinking water. Both wild animals and plant life depend on each other. It is a symbiotic relationship. For example, here the impala do more than just eat. They are assisting these plants to reseed. Many plants grow more readily once the seeds have been passed through an animal's digestive system. In this way, seeds are dispersed further afield, where they in time will germinate.
The lion, Africa's most formidable predator, can also go for long periods without water. It obtains most of its moisture requirements from the body fluids of the prey it hunts. Predators contribute to the health and maintenance of these natural systems by preying on those individuals least capable of defending themselves, the old, the sick, and the young. Nature favors only the healthy and agile. They are the survivors that reproduce. Lions have a very high reproductive rate, but they also suffer a high mortality. Nature makes no exceptions. It is estimated that over 80% of all lions in the wild die before they get old. The African wilderness has been a great lure to man. He first came to hunt the wild animals here thousands of years ago. But ever since he domesticated animals, he has looked at the wilderness and the wildlife living here and imagined herds of his own animals in their place. Man seems to ignore the fact that Africa's wild animals evolved here and are an important component to the maintenance of these ecosystems. Those species that did not adapt are now extinct. Drought occurs often in Africa, and rivers run dry. For those species that depend on water, drought is a time of extreme hardship, a time when endurance is tested to its limits. The animal with the greatest thirst is the elephant. Elephants depend on their engineering skills to survive long after most surface water is gone. They dig up the dry riverbeds. By successfully striking water, the elephant lures a variety of animals to his excavation. As watering holes dry up, animals from miles around converge on the diggings. But as the elephant numbers increase, they threaten their supply of drinking water. There is not enough to go around, and the competition becomes fierce. They frantically combine their efforts to dig deeper, but these efforts are made futile because of their high numbers. What a short time ago was a viable drinking place is now a mud bath. The elephants will soon be forced to search for water somewhere else. On the other hand, the large concentration of elephants makes life easier for species like the baboon. And baboons live here effortlessly, eating the undigested seeds they pick from the mounds of regularly deposited elephant droppings. For now, they flourish in a world filled with delectable treats. Elephants and man are both very destructive species, and their high numbers can irreversibly change a habitat. An adult elephant eats as much as 300 pounds of food daily. When elephants become concentrated around water, the available vegetation is steadily eaten up. In times of drought, when food is scarce, they spend up to 18 hours a day trying to satisfy their gigantic appetites, stripping bushes and trees of bark and leaves. Though elephants caused this trail of destruction, they are by no means the first to suffer. All species dependent on these woodlands are now endangered. The more selective feeders are the first victims of the elephant's excessive needs. This kudu searches for a few nutritious buds in a leafless world. As more woodland is stripped of bark, the trees die. The once green forest canopy is now gone, and the giraffe, normally safe from starvation because it feeds far above the other species, becomes threatened. All creatures, regardless of size or shape, are now locked into a life and death struggle which only the rains will end. Over millions of years, all species became progressively more resistant to drought. Those unable to adapt have become extinct. The secret to nature's success is adaptation. This warthog is a good example of adaptation. By preference a vegetarian, it becomes a carnivorous scavenger in times of stress, living off the carcasses of others less hardy than itself. The grass and woodland, once eaten, lie dormant, patiently awaiting the onset of the rains. Only then can the vegetation begin to recover. For many, the wait is too long, and they become the victims that nature willingly sacrifices to ensure the continued survival of these delicate ecosystems. Drought is nature's time-proven method of controlling excess numbers. The driest months determine the carrying capacity of the land. Regular droughts here keep a critical balance between high animal numbers and their food supply. Man understands relatively little about the intricate workings of these natural ecosystems. All that is known for sure is that they worked well for millions of years, until recently, when man started interfering with them. In time, the rains returned to the parched savanna, regenerating life and growth. The depleted populations are quick to recover. The cycle of life has come full circle. Development is continually reaching deeper into the heart of Africa. So more cattle country is secured and mile upon mile of wire fencing is built. Millions of dollars are currently spent on fences like this. This fence and others like it are part of the massive investment in cattle. An aerial view of the fence reveals the extent of the damage cattle are doing here. After only one season, all the grass has been eaten up on the left side of the fence. On the other lies productive grassland, and the desert is only a few steps away. In Botswana, the country's foreign-sponsored cattle programs have built hundreds of miles of fencing in an effort to prevent the spread of hoof and mouth disease. Designed to keep cattle and wild animals apart, the fences are a deadly barrier to wildlife, preventing their natural migration and cutting them off from their seasonal journeys to food and water. As they set out in the winter months, the herds move north to the Okavango and Botlele River. A veterinary cordon fence now blocks this migration, diverting them. The animals are lured east by the smell of water on the prevailing wind. For the lucky ones, the journey ends soon, entangled in a steel web. Over the years, these veterinary fences have taken a fearful toll. Every year there is more fencing, and so more animals die. The survivors continue on a journey that will take them through a hostile land, devastated by domestic stock. Everything is against the wildebeest. Time, the searing heat, the wasted landscape, and finally, the limitations of their own bodies. In time, man will come to recognize this as the true wilderness. Wasted figures, lost in a deathscape, created by indifference and lack of understanding. Once, grass covered the land as far as the eye could see. Now, only desert remains. For the survivors of this journey, there is nothing but bitter tragedy. The great waters of Lake Dao are no longer here. They have disappeared. Here there was once a great natural lake, its waters stretching as far as the eye could see. Man has pumped the lake dry. Now there is just another wasteland. Only these few small telltale pools of stagnating water remain. The wildebeest are lured to the pools of saline and stagnating water to quench their burning thirst. But this is not the source of the scent that drew them here. The smell of water that fills the air comes from here, a man-made dam only a few miles away. These waters from Lake Dao have been pumped here with no regard for the tens of thousands of wild animals that will die without them. The water was brought here to be more profitably used by a local diamond mine. The dam is now the only source of water for hundreds of miles, so men and their cattle flock here. Drinking from the pools of saline water has enraged the wildebeest's thirst. The exhausted animals search the dry lake bed for traces of fresh water, a search that will take them the rest of their lives. Man has unsuccessfully tried to preserve wild animals for aesthetic reasons, and so they continue to be destroyed in the face of growing commercial needs. The destruction of the wildebeest is not exceptional. It is the fate of all wild animals that have attempted to share the Earth's resources with man or stood in the way of his insatiable greed. Much of Africa may well be dying like the wildebeest. Only time will tell. But what is certain is that man and Africa's indigenous animals are at the end of an era. It is at this moment that one is able to glimpse both fragments of the past and the shape of things to come. The plight of Botswana's wildebeest has not gone undocumented. Renowned wildlife researcher Dr. Doug Williamson was studying the wildebeest at Lake Dow. Williamson explains.
As far as I can see, wildlife has very little future in this area because they have to compete directly with cattle for water and for grazing and with people for space. And more people are moving into the area, cattle numbers are building up. And the result is that conditions are steadily deteriorating, so that a situation arose last year in which more than 50,000 wildebeest died. And what you see right here is the mortal remains of several hundred wildebeest.
The tragedy here at Lake Dow is only one of the many similar events made possible by cattle development programs in these arid areas. The foreign development agencies that finance the African governments and encourage them to expand their commercial cattle programs are unlikely to ever get a fraction of their investment paid back. Hardly retribution for the senseless destruction of a country's most valuable resource, productive land. In Botswana, the grasslands continue to vanish at an unprecedented rate, and so more land is opened up to replace the overgrazed range. 10 years ago, this was grassland. Now it is desert. The association between environmental collapse and human suffering is well illustrated. 10 years ago, the country's people could feed themselves. Now, over 65% of them depend on food aid handouts. And while Botswana's government exports beef to Europe, more of its people become destitute. Colonial settlers started commercial cattle ranching here in East Africa at the end of the last century. This land belongs to David Hopcraft. His family has been ranching for many years. Cattle ranching in Africa is plagued by many problems. Cattle are extremely vulnerable to local disease. Commercial cattle ranching is only made feasible here because of veterinary technology, and the animals must be regularly treated with drugs and dips to protect them from disease and parasites, an expensive and time-consuming task. Cattle are particularly susceptible to disease carried by ticks. Ticks burrow down into their skins. At certain times of the year, cattle are so infested with ticks they must be dipped 3 or even 4 times a week, or they sicken and die. In some areas, the cattle live over half their lives in stockades, being protected from natural predators or undergoing dippings, inoculations, or some other form of veterinary program. Valuable time is expended here, time that animals should be out on the range, feeding. Multinational developers and local governments vigorously support most commercial cattle programs. They subsidize the massive infrastructure that supports cattle. Here, good money is thrown after bad. As efforts increase to support the beef industry, more land turns to desert. Dr. David Hopcraft explains.
These are the animals that man has chosen to replace all wildlife. They originate in the temperate regions of Europe and Asia, and so in Africa are at great disadvantage, being adapted to neither the local diseases nor the dry land conditions. Increasing technology is required to keep them alive, to meet man's growing needs.
For Hopcraft, cattle ranching became progressively less profitable over the years as his rangeland became more overgrazed. Hopcraft's common sense and his training as a wildlife research scientist made the choice obvious, and he started to ranch wild animals. When he began this venture, Hopcraft had hoped to produce as much from the wild animals as he had from cattle, but without wounding the land so deeply. What he had not expected was the discovery that Africa's game animals could be a more productive and profitable venture than cattle.
Here we're ranching wildlife rather than cattle, and we've been studying the system for 20 years. Throughout the worst drought in memory, we've been harvesting the game and in good condition. The remaining cattle on the ranch have suffered very badly, despite good management. And many of the ranches around us have been wiped out, with thousands of cattle dying. And with the rains coming, they're getting increased erosion and devastation. Here, under the wildlife regime, the vegetation is coming back, as it has for millions of years under this self-sustaining process.
Hopcraft believes that species diversity is the best way to maintain a healthy ecosystem, and his research shows that wild animals eat only the kind of plants best suited to their needs. As different species eat at different levels, their feeding puts less strain on the habitat. Where cattle once disrupted the ecosystem, the game is now assisting to re-establish the vegetational balance. The wild animals are resistant to most local diseases and unaffected by ticks, so they cost Hopcraft nothing to maintain. No dips, no vaccines, and no labor. Wild animals only drink a fraction of the water that was once needed by cattle, so there is now always enough water here for them. Most of the animals here have a higher reproductive rate than cattle, and so it has become essential that their numbers be kept in balance with the vegetation. The game is now regularly harvested to prevent overpopulation. This is the ranch's processing plant. The venison is being carefully inspected before leaving the ranch for a ready market in Nairobi. The incidence of diseased or substandard carcasses is a fraction of that once found in domestic stock, and lean game meat is devoid of saturated fats and unnatural chemicals. Scientific studies have shown that venison is healthier for human consumption than beef. Perhaps most important is the discovery that in times of drought, the general condition of wild animals is far superior to that of cattle.
Especially after this drought.
Hopcraft's ranch has demonstrated the feasibility of converting from cattle to wildlife ranching, and to date, it has proved to be an extraordinary success. In addition to creating a profitable game ranch, he has founded an important research center, assisted by the universities of Cornell and Alberta, as well as the Dutch Institute of Veterinary Medicine at Utrecht. It is hoped that this type of work will give Africa's people and the wild animals a better chance of surviving together in the future.
The wildlife system being used here is both workable and successful in practical and in economic terms. None of the veterinary and handling costs required for cattle apply, and we're already making more money than we've ever made with cattle. Vast areas of Africa could benefit from this system, and it could be the key to the survival of our most basic resource, productive land.
But for many people, the thought that wild animals may be ranched is still quite unacceptable. Every year, thousands of wildlife enthusiasts and would-be adventurers come to Africa to watch the marvelous wild animals. Already, many game reserves and the animals that live there are reliant on the tourists' money for their existence. As long as they keep coming, the animals are fairly safe. But if tourists stop coming, these game reserves can become an unaffordable luxury, and nothing stops tourism more effectively than civil unrest or war. As political conflict becomes increasingly common, more wilderness areas are lost forever. The question is now whether tourism can save these wilderness areas in the years that lie ahead. Most of Africa is now easily accessible by air. The airplane enables people to visit the remotest of areas in effortless comfort. tourist is a very much prized animal, and they are the only species found in these parts able to pay their way with foreign currency. For many lucky people, their African adventure is undoubtedly the experience of a lifetime. But it is now becoming increasingly evident that tourism alone is not enough to guarantee the future of these wilderness areas. As the track record shows, neither tourism nor the conservationists and their vigorous lobbying on behalf of Africa's animals have been able to stem the destruction. There are many game parks that still flourish, and for the moment at least, the wilderness is safe. But for every successful game reserve, there are many others that fail as the wilderness becomes victim to growing human need. As more people are forced to find new avenues of escape from growing desertification, cattle are moved into game reserves. Domestic stock seasonally invade many of Africa's fabled national parks, often the last remaining areas that have grass. As herds pour into the parks, the competition for food intensifies and the vegetation disappears under the onslaught of too many hungry animals. In a matter of only a few weeks, there will not be sufficient grass left, and they will then be forced to move on. Here, in one of East Africa's renowned game reserves, the domestic stock will quickly deplete the resident wild animals' food supply. In just a short time, they will eat the food reserves that the wild animals need to live out the rest of the dry season. When the grass is gone, the cattle are moved on, and the game reserve then becomes the goats' domain. Their sheer numbers overwhelm the land as they systematically devour the remaining vegetation. A few species will survive the first season's invasion, but eventually, in the drought years, they die a long, lingering death in a game reserve now no more than a sanctified ghetto. A short time ago, herds of animals could be seen here in tens of thousands. Now the park is virtually deserted. Only a few survivors are left, struggling in this depleted world. Once the buffalo roamed here in massive herds. Now only a solitary survivor can be found, and it tries to live off what the cattle overlooked. Small groups of gazelle roam the park in an effort to scavenge what the goats have left behind. The large herds of elephants have now been reduced to just a few small groups. The only ones unaffected by the depleted environment are the tourists. They continue to arrive in droves.
What a sight.
Beautiful.
Oh, wow.
I
can't believe it.
Flicking their tails. Look at that. Definitely, yes. It is a honeymoon setup.
A hungry mother and her young calf approach the human entourage in the hope of being fed. Their desperation mirrors the anguish of the African wilderness. The tragedies of the past, the pain of the present, and the uncertainty of the future. But to the visitors, these elephants appear majestic, a great spectacle to be admired and photographed. Tourist watching begins every morning at 6 a.m. The visitors then eagerly set out on the day's adventure. Buses and their occupants spend most of the day enveloped in clouds of choking dust as they jockey for positions in a race to find something worth photographing. Not an easy task, as now on any given day there are far more tourists than there are animals. Here, a solitary Grevy zebra is able to encounter herds of tourists on their daily excursion across the park. The minibus has become by far the park's most common species. Perhaps this is the future. A herd of buses roaming to and fro across the desolate countryside in search of remnants from the past. But in time, even man gives up the unequal struggle and goes elsewhere. After all, why should he pay $200 a day to photograph a wasteland? This devastation is not the work of invading humans or their cattle. The culprit here is overpopulation. The overpopulation of the only animal on Earth to rival man in its ability to destroy an environment. The ecosystem in this reserve is threatened by the overpopulation of one species, the elephant. We are flying over the Kruger National Park in South Africa. Below, the land is devastated. The result of an elephant population that has outgrown its food supply. There has been little rain this season, so grass cover was poor. What there was has long since been eaten away. The elephants now depend entirely on trees and woodland to satisfy their huge appetites. A good indicator of the situation here is these mutilated baobab trees. Some have been here for over 500 years. This year, the elephants devoured many of the ancient trees, not because their appetites have increased, only their numbers. The Kruger elephants once roamed far beyond the borders of this park. Now they have been fenced off from their traditional range to protect them from hostile man. This high-voltage electric fence blocks any attempt by the elephants to reach the outside world. Agriculture has sprung up on other borders, and it has become as much a barrier as the fences. The Kruger Park is now an ecological island. It has been surrounded by a sea of human encroachment. The Kruger is one of the largest game reserves in Africa. But even this 12,000 square mile reserve is only a fraction of the elephant's traditional range, and as their numbers grow, so their chances of survival diminish. Nature is not responsible for the elephant's unnatural confinement. Man is, and man alone can solve the problem he has created. If the population is not reduced, the fast-growing elephant numbers will further destroy the park's ecosystem. As food becomes increasingly scarce, not only the elephant, but many other species will be cut down by mounting starvation. Eventually, there would be only a few animals left, struggling in a shattered ecosystem. Knowing the alternatives, the Kruger Park's management is forced to intervene. Population control is a sad but necessary part of successful wildlife management programs. It is man's way of keeping the numbers of animals in balance with the ecosystem. The management policy at this park is to assess and regulate the elephant population. This year, 7,000 elephants were considered to be the optimum carrying capacity of the park. There were 7,450 elephants in the park, so 450 elephants are killed this season.
The laws of profit and loss apply here almost as vigorously as the laws of nature. Over the years, elephant harvesting at Kruger has become not only necessary, but profitable.
The paradox is that without this game reserve, there would be no confinement for the elephants, and this slaughter would be unnecessary. But in reality, without this game reserve, there would be no elephants left at all. The land would long ago have been claimed by farmers and ranchers. If elephants are to survive, their numbers will have to be carefully controlled. These are the unlucky ones. So it has finally come to this. Elephants are shot and canned because now there is not enough land left for all to survive. One may wonder how David Livingstone would react if he were here today. After all, it was only 150 years ago that the great explorer ventured into what he described as the limitless expanse of Africa. The profits from these culled animals are only a small part of a successfully run game reserve. The Kruger Park has come face to face with the harsh realities of modern-day conservation in a fast-changing world, and its continued existence is the reward. There are still many people that rely on wild animals for food. As technology improves, the hunter's advantage over his prey grows, and the animals become increasingly scarce. As ranching and agriculture spreads and game reserves are fenced off, some people's lives become more difficult. To these hunting communities, wild animals are their traditional source of food. They seldom kill more than they need in order to survive. Many families like these are now displaced people, all too often accused of the wholesale slaughter of Africa's wildlife. But in truth, they are usually just hungry communities trying as best they can to survive the only way they know. As more people become better equipped with modern weapons, animals have less chance. The early Europeans that came to Africa pioneered the destruction of wildlife. Now, commercial poachers, equipped with high-powered rifles and four-wheel drive vehicles, contribute to the destruction of what game remains. Man can now easily penetrate the remotest of areas, places that just a few years ago were inaccessible to him. Technology is creating a new form of evolution, and nature is helpless before it. Once most of the animals are dead, the cycle of destruction for the ecosystem begins, and the professional poachers move on. Hunting is not necessarily a threat to the wilderness. In some parts, hunting provides the critical dollars desperately needed to protect the wilderness. It is ironic that in a fast-changing world, these animals have now become dependent on hunters for their future here. Africa has always been the realization of a hunter's dream. Big game hunting is now an effective way of protecting the wilderness. The success of big game safaris is based on simple dollars and cents. With a $1,000 a day price tag for every day he spends here, this hunter pays dearly for the right to pursue these coveted trophies. 200 buffalo will be shot by trophy seekers this year, only a small percentage of the overall population, bearing in mind that 25,000 of them live here. Trophy hunters shoot relatively few animals. They spend most of their time in energetic pursuit of herds, trying to select the ultimate victim.
In stalking wild animals here in Africa, you're looking for one particular animal, the trophy animal in the herd. You may be stalking hundreds or thousands of animals. And this is why you must close to within a few meters to get a better look to pick out this one animal. Because you will only select one from the herd, and you may have to track them or stalk them for hours during the day. It may take you a whole day to pick out the one animal from this huge herd.
Hunting concessions are substantial areas of land, usually bordering national parks, and are leased by independent safari operators. Some concessions are almost as large as the reserves they adjoin. The animals can move freely between the totally protected game reserves and the hunting areas. For game reserves, hunting concessions provide an effective buffer against human encroachment. The constant presence of the safari operators discourages poaching. Without these areas, many more game reserves would be in danger. The trophy hunter's mentality is bewildering to many conservationists who condemn hunting of any kind. But the reality is that if trophy hunters keep coming with money, the buffalo's future and that of the other animals will be assured. If hunting is stopped, the land and the animals on it will quickly fall victim to infinitely more formidable and ruthless killers: cattle and agriculture.
And he's still going in here. You got him in the... Yeah, it was a good shot.
I'll come every year for the rest of my life, or until it's gone, until the game and the territory, the countryside has been obliterated by progress.
The African wilderness and all wildlife are now threatened. Over 98% of Africa's wilderness areas have been penetrated by man, and the list of endangered animals is growing longer every day. For many that a few years ago were common in the wild, extinction now appears imminent. In recent years, Herculean efforts have been made to save some of the more aesthetically pleasing endangered animals. As a last desperate resort, some species are moved to parks and zoos in Europe and the USA to give them a better chance. It is a natural human tendency to ignore the environment while paying attention to the rare and beautiful. This preoccupation is distracting conservationists from saving many vital and irreplaceable ecosystems. Sadly, conservationists have not responded effectively to the plight of these natural areas. Unless they do so, they will continue to simply disappear. Many wild animals, and indeed the wilderness itself, are now in great peril. Unless change comes soon, many game reserves may vanish forever. The future of Africa's threatened habitat will depend on an ability to recognize the need for more sustainable forms of wildlife utilization. Programs must be designed to meet Africa's needs, while at the same time preserving the natural resources. The survival of any species depends on an ability to adapt to its environment. This fundamental law of nature applies to man as much as it does to other species. If a balance between high numbers and a sustainable food supply is not maintained, nature steps in to regulate. Its method is drought. The inescapable outcome, starvation. In truth, man has learned very little about the natural world, and he should not experiment to see how far he can degrade it before the entire system collapses. The environmental collapse of these low rainfall regions is the first symptom of what could prove to be the human species' most irredeemable weakness: an uncontrollable desire to ruthlessly exploit and profit in the short term at the cost of its long-term survival. Man is engineering his own destitution. As he does so, the overexploited earth becomes less productive and more people starve. Nothing is more basic to a stable world than food. The technology to feed the Earth's hungry people is available, but the missing components are understanding and leadership. To stabilize human numbers while preserving the environment is the greatest challenge left to man. His very future now depends on it. The only possible outcome of Africa's exploding populations will be increased destitution. To believe that foreign food aid can be anything more than a temporary stopgap is naive. The thoughtless overexploitation of an irreplaceable resource like productive land may well be the first step down the road to disaster for all mankind. The condition of our natural world has become a barometer of our own destiny. To survive, we must change from frenzied development to sustainable growth. What path Africans choose remains to be seen. But what is painfully obvious is that there is little time left for choosing. If Africa cannot be steered clear of its disastrous course, there is little reason to be optimistic about the future of this planet.